Slater Crusaders, America's greatest country in the world. Glad you're here. Thanks for being here. Hey, download the free app on in the App Store. Just search for The First TV. It's right there. Super easy to use. All the shows on demand, and you can watch live as well. I want to start here. Tell a very quick story of Malcolm McLean. I would do this story like Paul Harvey style, and I'd like save his name to the end and like tell the whole story, and then be like, and that's the story of Malcolm McLean. Now you know the rest of this, but no one's ever heard his name before. I've never heard his name before. Malcolm McLean. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right. But he may be one of the most important entrepreneurs in the last 100 years. So he was born in 1913, grew up in Winston-Salem. His family didn't have enough money to send him to college, but he did have enough money to buy a truck, 120 bucks. So he bought a big truck, delivered things to places. 1937, he was delivering cotton bales from Fayetteville, North Carolina to Hoboken, New Jersey. And he got to Hoboken, and he had to sit in his truck for hours, almost all day, waiting to unload his truck, right? Other trucks were in front of him unloading their stuff, and he had to wait in line. And this is what he said. He said, I had to wait most of the day to deliver bales, sitting there in the truck, watching stevedores like longshoremen, like people unloading, load other cargo. It struck me that I was looking at a lot of wasted time and money. I watched them take each crate off the truck and slip it into the sling, which would then lift the crate into the hold of the ship, and on and on and on. So long story short, because of him watching this and saying, well, this is super inefficient, he invented the shipping container, right? So instead of unloading and reloading each item off of a truck onto a ship and then vice versa off the ship onto another truck, let's just lift up the entire container and put it on the ship. And because of him and some other factors as well, but that being one of the big ones, global shipping prices went from $6 a ton to 16 cents a ton. So the life lesson here, and this is from the CEO of Shopify, which is now this big giant company. He operates, the CEO of Shopify, operates under the assumption that everything he is doing could be wrong. Everything could be wrong. And he said the best company that exists in America and the world today, the best company, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being perfect, is a 6. The best company that exists is a 6 on the perfect company scale, which means there's so much room for improvement. Everything he does could be wrong. It's easy to think in the moment that we have it all figured out. You know, we laugh at assumptions that people made 50 years ago or 20 years ago. But 50 years from now, people are going to look back on us and laugh just like we laugh at people from 50 years before us. The example I always use with this is bloodletting. Bloodletting used to be a thing. We're going to talk about George Washington actually coming up in a little bit here, but George Washington, some people argue, died from bloodletting. He had this major throat infection and they couldn't cure it, so doctors kept coming and they didn't know what to do, so they released 4 liters of blood out of George Washington. That's 8 times as much as when you donate blood. What in the world? You look at your bloodletting. Like, what is that? How would you even think bloodletting would be a thing? But people are going to look back at chemotherapy as just as cruel and horrible. Like, you would do what? People in 2020 would do what with people with cancer? That's insane. Like, you'd kill every cell hoping that, right? We need to question everything and assume that everything we're doing could be wrong. So you just think like societally today. How did we get to where we are today? Let's just think of like just the office. Like, why do we get in cars, drive an hour, sitting in traffic forever, so you could go to a building and have meeting after meeting after useless meeting, waste hours all day being super inefficient in an office, and then get back in your car, commute another hour, and that's your work day? Like, what was that? Why do we do that? Same with schools, right? Don't get me started on schools. That'll be a whole nother thing. But why do we do things the way we do them? They make no sense. We just it's a frog in boiling water thing. We just kind of slowly start going, and we never question anything. Why? Why are we doing it this way? Why do we have everyone commute to an office 5 days a week for 8 hours a day? Oh, we do 8 hours a day because that's a 24-hour day divided into 3 shifts. That's why we make people work 9 to 5, an old industrial revolution holdover. It's an old industrial revolution manufacturing holdover. So why do we do that now? There's no data that says human beings work best in 8-hour work chunks. There's no reason we do that other than we've been doing it that way since the Industrial Revolution. Well, that's not a reason. Could we just stop with that nonsense once and for all? How about we all agree that, of course, if you work in a job that can be done like this, right? Different jobs are different, right? Obviously. But how about you work until the job's done for the day? All right. Not an arbitrary 8 hours because that's 1/3 of the time it takes for the Earth to rotate on its axis. There's a stupid reason to be forced to work 8 hours a day. Anyway, I share this because I hope this quarantine time, or whatever this time is, I guess we're past quarantine, I don't know. Whatever this time is, I hope it exposes a lot of weaknesses in our society, in our culture, in our economy that we've just ignored or overlooked because it's the way we've always done it. Let's question everything again. Just like Malcolm McLean, right? Malcolm McLean, in a time of pause, sitting in line, was like, this doesn't make sense. There's gotta be a better way. And he revolutionized the entire world. We can all do that to ourselves. A little time of pause, we're looking at something and be like, oh wait, that doesn't make any sense. I got a minute? Yeah, let's play this clip of Joe Rogan from the other day.
Yeah, I might move to Texas. Callan and I and Shab have actually talked about this.
Getting a ranch together?
Well, if here's the thing. If California continues to be this restrictive,
yeah,
I don't know if this is a good place to live. First of all, it's extremely expensive. The taxes here are ridiculous.
Yeah.
And if they really say that we can't do stand-up until 2022 or something like that, I might jet.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. This is silly. I don't need to be here. The only reason why I'm here is that I'm close to people like you.
Right.
A lot of my friends live here.
Yeah.
The store's here. But if they won't let us do the store, but we could do stand-up other places, why would we stay here?
The store's a stand-up place in Hollywood. I wonder how many people are doing that calculus in their head. So I live here in California, so I'm kind of thinking from a California mindset, but just thinking that this is time to make a big life change, whatever it is. In his case, it's get the heck out of California. We're gonna do a segment tomorrow about how this time period should be known as the Great Accelerator, because it's taken things in every realm, economic things, and just accelerated them, right? So businesses that were on the brink are now bankrupt or going out of business. Pier 1, I just read this morning that Pier 1 Imports, they're gone, they're done. It's out, they're going out of business totally. So this accelerated that. Maybe they would have gone out of business in a few years anyway, but now it's like, this is the end. Relationships, and it goes both ways, right? So if your marriage was not doing well, then this time period just accelerated everyone down this path. And if your marriage was in a good place, then this time period accelerated that, and maybe now you're closer than ever. Friendships, same thing. I think this has accelerated everything. If you were planning on moving, I think this accelerated that move. One of my friends used to live here in San Diego, and he used this time. I say he used this time. He got fired. He got fired from his job. So he's like, all right, this is it. This is the time. They've been talking about moving to Washington for years. But it's hard. It's hard to leave a job, right, to go to an unknown. But this was the kick in the pants, and he did it, and he FaceTimed us from his house, or from where he's living now. There's all this land, and it's beautiful and amazing, and they're thrilled. California specifically, there's a couple things that keep people in California, and because we have a 13.3% income tax, right? Income tax, 13% state income tax is crazy to live here. But the things that keep people here is job. Again, it's hard to leave and voluntarily leave your job, and friends and family. You know, people got family here. It's hard to pick up and leave friends and family, leave a known entity to go to an unknown in a new place that you don't know anyone. But, I mean, if we're in this mode for a while here in California where there's no work and Or let's say, so you can't work because no businesses are open, or you can work from home, and now you can work anywhere, so there's nothing even tying you to California paying a 13% income tax. And if we continue this mode where you can't even go see your friends, and you can't even be near your parents, like less than 6 feet, the bonds that are keeping people in California are weaker than ever. Can't even go to the beach. And I think we talked the other day, maybe we didn't get to it, on Gavin Newsom. You know, the governor of California and New York and all the blue states, you know they're going to pay for all this by raising taxes. You think they're going to pay for all this by lowering taxes and encouraging business growth and expansion? No way. They're going to pay for this by if they don't get the bailouts from the federal government, which I don't think Trump should give. I don't think he will, and obviously he shouldn't. All these blue state governors are going to pay for this by raising your taxes. So it's going to be even worse to live in these states. We've been calling this time the Great Realization, where we realize the things that are most important in life and hopefully reprioritize those things moving forward. So it's the Great Realization, but it's also the Great Accelerator. Because in a way, oddly, things are moving faster than ever, not slower. So you put both those things combined, the Great Realization and the Great Accelerator. You put those both together. Has there ever been a better time to question everything? Because again, even the best company in the world is only operating at a 6 on the perfection scale. There's lots to improve. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. I just wanted to talk a little more with professor at the Yale Law School, Logan Byrne, specifically about his book, Blood of Tyrants, George Washington and the Forging of the Presidency. Logan, as you corrected during the break, what island in the Caribbean did George Washington go to when he was a boy?
Barbados. I had it in my mind. I should have just said it, but I might say the wrong one.
There's your Jeopardy trivia for the day. What is Barbados? So whenever I see a George Washington book, I'm just gonna be honest, I'm like, man, if someone tasked me with writing a George Washington book, it'd be so daunting, and I'd be like, there's a billion. He's probably the most written about person ever. How did you, why, and then how did you decide to come to this man and write more about him?
Sure. So it actually started as a project in law school. So I was a student. I needed to write a big paper to graduate. And I wrote on, when they say the president should be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, what does that even mean? So the commander-in-chief clause throughout history has been a great source of debate. What are the powers of the presidency? What are the powers of Congress? And you see time and time again, there's this tug of war. And so I thought, well, it's pretty obvious to me when they say the president should be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, it was literally the guy in front of the room, George Washington, the only commander-in-chief that we'd ever had. So I thought, okay, let's go back and look at the history to see what he did during the Revolutionary War. And we were just talking about what he did with the epidemic of smallpox then, but there's all sorts of other issues, rights of citizens during wartime, troops and torture, military commissions, all sorts of juicy things to look at and learn from it. And so, I teach at law school now, and what I was saying before, this has constitutional weight. This is what they look to when they talk about originalism and saying, okay, when the Constitution was formed, what did they have in mind? And that actually, when the Supreme Court or judges are looking at that, they look at exactly this history to see what the law is today.
Wow. Okay. So I want to make sure I get something you said right. So how much of, and obviously there are things different from now, from 1776, but how much of a commander-in-chief today is based off of what George Washington did, as opposed to what our founding fathers kind of came up with based on their breadth and wisdom and knowledge of history? Or was there a lot on just the guy George Washington and his wisdom and the things he did?
Well, it's really about George, and the reason that is
wow, it's amazing.
So George was not operating in a vacuum here. So he knew, he looked back to history. He learned from what the best practices were from before, what the terrible practices of the king that they were fighting against were. And so he was not in a vacuum here. And he was also going back with members of the Continental Congress or in the state legislatures. So he was not, he was not alone. But when you look through and see what are the powers of the commander-in-chief, our president today, it really goes back to what George did and what was approved of. And now this was not, I feel like in history class, and at least in high school, you sort of see them as, demigods that sort of divine the answers to these questions. That's completely incorrect. I mean, they couldn't be further from the truth. They were getting things wrong left and right. And they were learning amid, an invasion of what these powers were. What I argue and what the book argues is that what they developed throughout the course of the war to be the powers of the presidency versus the rights of citizens, and what was distilled through George Washington is what continues on to this day.
Okay, give me one example.
Okay, so rights of citizens during times of war, times of crisis. So it's something we were just talking about before. So Washington and the president today has a lot of power when it comes to foreign nationals. So that's closing the borders, in dealing with foreign nationals overseas or foreign nationals on U.S. soil. The president has a lot of power and say then. But then when it comes to when you bring that home and domestically, where the power is over citizens themselves, different story. That's sort of a main divide that Washington established. And so when it came to the powers over the citizens themselves, they have rights. The Constitution was created to protect the citizens from government. And so therefore, the commander-in-chief has a lot less say.
What was a foreign national back then that George Washington dealt with that he was able to say, I have more say over you, less over the citizens?
Sure. So when it involved Ethan Allen, one of our heroes, was captured. He was sort of he was Vermonter, a very colorful character. And Washington found out that there's stories that he was being tortured. And that the British were doing all sorts of horrible things to him because he was sort of he was a rabble rouser, and he was driving the British nuts because he was sort of saying awful things to them as they walked by. But they were torturing him, they said. So Washington said, okay, well, then I am justified in torturing my prisoners. So if it means saving Ethan Allen's and other U.S. soldiers' rights, then I have torture as an option to me. And then there was a big debate about whether he could do that. Was supposed to be left up to Continental Congress or the state legislatures? And in the end, Washington felt that it was his right as commander-in-chief to treat foreign nationals, even going as far as possibly torture, if that meant saving the citizens.
Yes, but a citizen would never do something like that too.
Oh, absolutely not. So he had no say. So another example would be so the great Benedict Arnold, the great traitor. We never captured him. Captured his two co-conspirators, and one was an American named Joshua Het Smith, and the other one was a British intelligence officer named John Andre. When we capture the two of them, Washington goes up to them and says, "I have enough evidence to hang you on yonder tree," but he doesn't. Instead, he gives Smith, the American, a 2-week-long trial and due process, which people saw as outrageous because this guy looked as guilty as sin and Washington wanted him dead. Everyone wanted him dead. And sure enough, he gets off because there's a high burden of proof for American citizens. Meanwhile, John Andre, caught in this sort of exact same scheme, actually a much more sympathetic guy. Hamilton really liked the guy, and he was a young man that he was smart and people liked him. Too bad he was hanged in 2 days.
No way. Wow, that's an amazing story. That's an amazing story that George Washington would have the principle to hold back on his rage or against one man. Right? How do you articulate that? Like, that's a beautiful story.
That's exactly right. His rage and his fear. I mean, the Benedict Arnold story was he was betraying West Point, so one of our most important military installations at the time, defending the Hudson River from the British ships. Arnold was going to give it over to the British, and Washington, he trusted Arnold. So when he finds out this conspiracy is unfolding, he was terrified. He was livid, but he felt he wanted to hang Smith, but he didn't.
Yeah.
So he thought it was more important that enduring precedent that he created about than it was to kill any one man and have justice that he thought that the man deserved.
So he knew he knew his role in creating a legacy for the future, right? He knew that posterity would be looking back on him in this time. That was a burden on him.
He really did. He knew it amazingly well. He documented everything. About 140,000 letters were connected to him. So he had a team helping him write the letters, but he, throughout the war, so 140,000, he was documenting everything because he hoped that what he was doing was creating this new nation upon a hill that people would look back to like us today, and we'd still be talking to him. He hoped this would happen.
That's great. I'm glad we're making GW happy here. I may be able to fit two of these in because they're similar. What would you say the biggest intellectual influence was in his life? Like book he read, scholar from before his time, or whatever. Intellectually, what was his biggest influence?
Hamilton, interestingly enough. So Washington, yes. So he deferred to Hamilton a lot. He knew that Hamilton was much more of an intellectual than he was. And so this is, people look back in history and they think of, I feel like you learn Jefferson, you think he's so smart and educated. He's the sort of type of person that the more you learn about him, the more sort of wishy-washy you think he is. Washington's the exact opposite. People don't see him sort of as the brains of the revolution, but he really was, but just in a very different way. So like we were talking about before, Washington, his father passes away, so he does not get this sort of elite European education that others of his original stature would have. And he had that sort of a chip on his shoulder where he felt that he didn't have the proper education. So that meant he was constantly checking his penmanship to show, look, I really am educated. I can do this.
Yes.
But what his genius was he was politically incredibly adept as far as bringing people together, bringing coalitions together, getting people to follow him, and sort of seeing the war as a PR battle in which I need to do things like elevate the rights of this man Smith and the rights of citizens over anything else that I want in order to show that our nation is different and we are worth fighting for. So he was brilliant in the political sense, and also in the sense that he was willing to defer to others that he saw as really smart, like Hamilton.
That's great. We got about 30 seconds for this question. By the way, all good George Washington historians should throw in a dig at Thomas Jefferson whenever possible. I believe the word was Thomas Jefferson was wishy-washy would be the attack on Thomas, which is fine. 30 seconds, biggest influence of his childhood that affected who he was. I mean, you mentioned his dad dying, right? But was there anything else that comes to mind that made him the man he was?
Well, his mother, really. So his mother was an interesting character. She was, sort of deferred to Washington as the man of the house, starting at 13. And so look at the correspondence throughout the war, and it'd be interesting things like Washington would be off fighting battles, losing left and right, trying to keep the army together, dodging bullets. And his mother would write notes like, well, you didn't go to the store for me, and, where's my, produce? And so she really kept helping them keep grounded. And she, in some ways, she's very embarrassing. There's some rumors that she was a loyalist. So I think she really helped him get to let too much go to his head. And that was starting from his childhood all the way, on into adulthood. His mother was a sort of powerful influence.
That's a worthy study. I've never read or learned anything about her before. Logan Byrne, awesome. So the National Review, just Google Logan Byrne, B-E-I-R-N-E, and read his latest National Review piece about George Washington and smallpox. And then pick up the book too, Blood of Tyrants, George Washington and the Forging of the Presidency. Logan, let's talk again, man. Superb job. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Good talking to you.
True story. Mike Slater, more coming up. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. I love this story we're going to share here when I first read it because it fits under our whole thing of there's nothing new under the sun. This has all been done before. So let's take the time to learn the lessons from people who have done this before. And there's no better person to learn lessons from than George Washington himself. So Logan Byrne is here. Professor Byrne, he's a lecturer at the Yale Law School, and his book is Blood of Tyrants, George Washington and the Forging of the Presidency. Mr. Byrne, how are you, sir?
Great, thank you. How are you?
Good to talk to you, man. Thanks for writing this piece. So tell us the story. So we got George Washington. He's the head of the army. Very early in the war, things are going poorly. Is that a good place to start?
Absolutely. We are losing left and right. And in the middle of all that, we're facing an epidemic, just like today. And I know for history nerds like you and me, it's fun to look back at this, but I think it's really important to ground ourselves today in this history because, one, it's enlightened of us to learn from what our founding fathers did and what were the rights of citizens versus government. And number two, I teach over at law school. It's constitutionally important. It has legal impact. So looking back, George Washington, he faced the smallpox epidemic. And what he did and what the colonies did to react to that epidemic, I think we're seeing parallels with today's crisis.
Okay, talk me through it. What do we got?
Sure. So Washington, first of all, he saw the rights of citizens versus government as very different than we might today. So he sort of saw individuals as having a responsibility as citizens to collaborate and do what's best for themselves and work together to face an epidemic rather than have a sort of nanny state where government would impose their views on the citizens themselves. Remember, rewind 1776, we're fighting against what we saw as a tyrannical British crown. So our last thing we want to do is replace that with a government that's just as tyrannical today. So what Washington does is he looks at what's happening to his troops, and we're getting smallpox left and right. So smallpox is a horrible, horrible disease. You get rashes. It's a virus that's spread via the air like today, like COVID-19. It shows fever, coughing, rash, and within 14 days, like today, like COVID-19, you show symptoms. So this was just ravaging his troops. And what Washington does is he decides to do quarantines. I mean, that's all we knew, and sort of what we're doing today. But they're not working. People, it's a free society, even within the Continental Army. So they're getting it. They're still getting it. So what he ends up doing is pushing for inoculation. So just like we have vaccines today, back then they had this sort of gross procedure. It was actually invented and realized in India and used for thousands of years effectively there. But for Europe and sort of Western society, it was pretty new to us, where you'd scratch the arm of a healthy person, and then you'd rub pus from a smallpox patient into the wound. And if you receive smallpox that way, you are sick, but you're not so bad. As opposed to inhaling it, then you get the full-blown version, and then there's a 17% chance you die. So he decides to inoculate, and he ends up being the first military leader to do mass inoculations in the military. So in that way, we end up winning the war in large part because of Washington's inoculations.
Wow, unbelievable. So you say he was the first, so that had to obviously be super controversial. What was the pushback from his peers, and then the pushback from the troops to try to pull something like that off?
Absolutely. There was a lot of pushback. I mean, originally we were fighting in New York City, and in New York State at the time, it was illegal to inoculate. A doctor was arrested trying to help inoculate Washington's troops because people were worried about this. Just like today, there's a lot of misinformation going around. There's a lot of confusion about what was right, and sort of the experts didn't know, quite was right either. They're sort of fumbling along like the rest of us.
Yeah.
And so Washington, he in many ways, he was convinced by Martha Washington. So his wife, Martha, she was a headstrong woman, and she wanted to visit her husband, but she knew she couldn't because she'd get smallpox and likely, possibly die. So what she did was she went, and she broke, the law and went and got inoculated, and that helped show Washington sort of what he already thought was that inoculation and following the science was the best route. And he ended up, that was sort of the final straw in pushing him to say, you know what?
No way.
Inoculate troops. and this is how we're going to save the troops.
Wow. How did it go for the troops, right? Do you have any evidence of some people getting way too sick, or like how are the results?
So we ended up doing most inoculations down at Valley Forge over the winter. And the tricky part was when you get it through the gross arm pus way, you're still a bit sick, and you could potentially spread it. But what Washington did was he waited until the winter, because there were fewer campaigns then. So he just sort of hoped the British wouldn't attack while his troops were sick. And he, at Valley Forge, he had mass inoculations, and then he quarantined within the camp so they wouldn't spread to each other, sort of the old-fashioned breathing in way. And we lucked out. The British did not realize we were doing this. They didn't know we were weakened for that month or two during the winter. And once the spring came around, we were inoculated against smallpox, and the British weren't.
Unbelievable. I believe that we've never, like, as much as we've all studied, I've never heard anything about smallpox during the Revolutionary War. That's wild. But also, I guess prior to this, I never really thought much about the Spanish flu during World War I either. But that killed way more people than the war did, the Spanish flu did. Was that true during Revolutionary War II? Was this, like, how many people, do we know how many people smallpox killed versus battles killed?
Sure. So for every one soldier that was killed in battle, 10 others died from smallpox.
What?
Disease. Oh yeah, it was a war of germs. In fact, the British tried to use smallpox against us. So again, just like today, our adversaries tried to use infectious disease and our weakness against us. And with the British, that was, quite literal. They had plans to dip arrows in, the pus from the smallpox victims and fire them at our soldiers and remember, these are times when we have guns. So the full intent was to create infection and injure with arrows that were laced in smallpox. And, there's no evidence they actually executed this plan, but there definitely were writings from British officers to use smallpox as a direct bio warfare weapon.
Good night. Okay, George Washington himself, in your article, I've never heard any of this stuff before. In your article, you talk about why he was immune from, is that the right word? I don't know if that's the right word, whatever, but he had immunity from smallpox. Tell that story here, it's super interesting.
Sure. As a young boy, he had traveled to the Caribbean, and he'd gotten it. And in fact, you don't see this on the dollar bill, but he had smallpox scars on his face. And as a child, he survived it. And then that meant, luckily for us in the United States, that he was immune for the rest of his life. So by having had it as a child, he was protected, and that became very important.
And where was he when he got it?
Oh, which island was it? He was in the Caribbean.
Yeah, you said, somewhere in the Caribbean, right? I remember you said. So why was he there? I remember when I read your article, I was like, I didn't even know he was there. Why was he there as a boy?
So he was there. So it's interesting. You think of Washington as sort of being born into the gentry. Well, his father was, sort of the upper crust Virginia society, but then he died when Washington was 13, and that sort of all went away. But when Washington was a child, his father had a decent amount of money, and he was able to travel, and sort of he had the whole plan to see the world and be educated in Europe as the sort of high society of the United States would then. But then when he's 13, Washington's father dies, and that sort of all changes. And that's when you see Washington now, what he became, is a sort of a humble man who was humbled by this experience of his father's death.
Wow, amazing. Okay, so let's wrap this up. If you don't mind, Logan, I'd love to talk more about the book in general. Is that okay? Can you stick around for another segment?
Yes, please. Absolutely.
Got like 10 more minutes or so, but let's wrap this up here. So let's just run through real quick the parallels let's do the lessons learned. Lesson learned today from George Washington.
Yeah, so it's great to look at what the government had done versus civilians. So that's sort of the big conversation we're having nationally today, where is it okay to keep the U.S. population under lockdown as the states are doing? I'm here in Connecticut. We're still under lockdown. We're starting to open up phase 1, but it's still unclear. They keep changing the timeline. So back then, they saw a different approach to government, and sort of the idea of a nanny state was not yet ingrained. Instead, they saw the government's role to, like Washington, he led by examples. He would never dream of forcing inoculations or quarantine on civilians. Instead, he did it with his troops and then used that as an example to show the rest of us what might work and what might happen. But the main point was that it was up to the citizens themselves to decide what was best for their circumstances. So this is government on a very local level. So, for instance, in my case, my wife is expecting our first child. I'm already a neurotic father, and he's not even born yet. So for me, don't plan opening up anytime soon. I sort of plan to keep ordering takeout. For my circumstances, I'm worried about that sort of an infection. So for me, it makes a lot of sense to stay under lockdown. However, does it mean the government should have the power to force everyone to also be on lockdown because my wife might get infected? No, according to the history, absolutely not. So what we could learn from then is that it was incumbent upon local government and individuals themselves to work as a community to take serious threats, which I think COVID-19 is, to adapt according to what makes sense for your community, what makes sense for your household.
So I keep going, I've been going back and forth with this the entire last 2.5 months. And I'm so glad you brought in George Washington's thoughts and actions, because I'm a conservative, small government, limited government, localism guy. And 99.99% of the time, I feel like the one time when like the individualist, like go at your own like spirit that I love so much, the one time when maybe it's not the best thing is in the middle of a pandemic, because obviously you can affect other people without even really knowing it. So as limited government and localism as I am, an individual free choice, when Bill Gates come out and said, no, we got to shut down the whole country because people could travel and, all of a sudden, I was like, maybe he's right. And then like, no, localism, like the small, like federalism, limited government. So I bounce back and forth in ways that I never have ever before in my life. But I love the George Washington approach. And I think in the end, that's probably the right approach still, even in a pandemic. Is that fair? Are you tracking my inconsistencies?
I'm right there with you. It's tricky. And there is a place for government, and it's sort of it's almost the bigger the worse, so instead of the bigger the better, where sort of the idea of a nationwide lockdown would be, would make much sense, and also would be contrary to what the history would suggest are the powers of the federal government. But then when you go down to a state level, okay, getting better, but still, looking, close to where I am, New York City is very different from upstate New York. So, Governor Cuomo is starting to get that, and he's starting to have a different approach to the different areas of New York State. But even then, it starts becoming very different, where in New York City, with a massive outbreak in very close quarters, government coordination makes a lot more sense than it would upstate, where maybe it would make more sense for, each community, a rural town to decide, okay, well, we're going to close this, and this, but not that, and that, which would be very different from New York City.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm grateful for George Washington's expertise there. Logan, can you stick around? We'll talk a bit about the book.
Excellent. Sounds great.
Awesome. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. So we may be getting a little bit in front of our skis here on this one, but I don't know, maybe not. I didn't think a vaccine would ever be made, right? That's been my thought for a while now. But as we talked with Professor Racaniello on Monday, he said there's 70 vaccines in development. 8 of them are in human trial right now. 8. Nothing like that's ever been done before. It's Operation Warp Speed, as the president called it. Nothing like this has ever been done. So I don't know, maybe one of those will make it across the finish line, a couple of them to varying degrees of efficacy, I guess. I don't know. Again, Professor Racaniello seems pretty confident that one of these vaccines will come around next year. So it's one thing to make one. So it's one thing to invent one, and then it's another thing to be able to mass produce one. That's another huge question. But then the final question is, are people going to take it? And I don't think so. I mean, what do I know, right? It's a guess. But I think 30% of people will take it. voluntarily. I mean, you may feel totally differently. You may think most people will. I think you get like 30%. Or maybe some will be forced to, like, because you work in a hospital or you're a police officer or something like that. So I think that's where you get to 30%. And then, so you get 30% take the vaccine, you get 30% by that time, maybe we'll have natural immunity at that point, just because they got the disease and got better, got the virus and got better. So you got like 60% of people who are immune, vaccine plus immunity. So we need like 70 or 80%. So how do you get that last 10 or 20% of people to take the vaccine who don't want to get the vaccine? So here's the rub. Here's the question. Can the government force you to get a vaccine? Can the government force you to get a vaccine? And the answer is yes. This is Alan Dershowitz on that question.
Let me put it very clearly. You have no constitutional right to endanger the public and spread a disease, even if you disagree. You have no right not to be vaccinated. You have no right not to wear a mask. You have no right to open up your business.
Wait, can I stop you? No right not to be vaccinated, meaning if they decide you have to be vaccinated, we have to be vaccinated?
Absolutely. And if you refuse to be vaccinated, the state has the power to literally take you to a doctor's office and plunge a needle into your arm. If the vaccination
Where is that in the Constitution?
If the vaccination is designed to prevent the spreading disease. If the vaccination is only to prevent a disease that you will get, for example, if there's a disease that will kill you, you have the right to refuse that, but you have no right to refuse to be vaccinated against a contagious disease. Public health, the police power of the Constitution, gives the state the power to compel that, and there are cases in the United States Supreme Court.
Wow. So a quick disclaimer, I'm sure Dershowitz, we're not saying this should be the reality or shouldn't, just a statement of fact based on the Supreme Court cases that we're going to go over on here in a second. That is the reality of the situation. Remember in the very beginning, this is like early March, we had a legal expert on to talk about your rights of quarantine. And can the government rip you from your house and force you to go into quarantine? And the answer is yes, and you have no legal recourse whatsoever. Very similar here. You have no legal recourse whatsoever. The government can do that. Now, there's an interesting nuance here that Dershowitz mentions at the end. The state, they cannot force you to get a vaccine from a disease that doesn't spread to other people. But they can force you if that disease spreads to someone else. So let's say there was a vaccine against, I don't know, like lung cancer. They came up with some vaccine that fights lung cancer. The states can't force you to get that one because you can't spread lung cancer to other people. But if it's a disease like COVID that does spread, then the government can. So it's an interesting nuance there that I think is worthy. So here's one of the cases. It was Jacobson versus Massachusetts, 1905. Massachusetts was one of 11 states at the time that mandated everyone to get vaccinated. And if you refused, it was a $5 fine. 1902, there was a smallpox outbreak. And the Board of Health of Cambridge, by the way, there's nothing new under the sun, right? This is all this stuff has happened before. 1902, the Board of Health at Cambridge ordered everyone to get either vaccinated or revaccinated. There was a pastor who is in Cambridge, but he lived in Sweden for a while. When he was a boy, or he was a little old, he was a young man, and they had mandated vaccines as well for smallpox. And he got it when he was in Sweden, and he had a terrible experience from it. I don't really know what it was, right? But he said he had a lifelong horror of the practice. He and his son, so that's why he was a younger man because he had a young boy at the time. But they both had really bad reactions to the vaccines. I don't know what that means exactly. I don't know if that means they just got the disease really bad or he hates needles. I couldn't find any exact detail of what the problem was, but he called it extreme suffering, great and extreme suffering from the vaccine he had to take back in Sweden. So he didn't want to do it again. He thought he and his family had some sort of genetic disposition against vaccines or something, and he called it an invasion of his liberty, and it was unreasonable and arbitrary and oppressive. And went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled 7-2 against him. We got to go here. I could quote at great length. In every well-ordered society charged with the duty of conserving the safety of its members, the rights of the individual in respect of his liberty may at times under the pressure of great dangers, be subjected to such restraint, and be enforced by reasonable regulations as the safety of the general public may demand. And we could go on and on. There was an exemption. They put a small exemption in there for extreme cases. That if giving a vaccine to a person is cruel and inhumane, then you don't have to do it. But they didn't really define what cruel and inhumane means. You would think it would be this guy would be able to claim that, but this guy didn't fit that bar even. So I don't know who would. There was another case in 1922 that said a school could refuse to admit a student who didn't have vaccines as well. So this is all in the Supreme Court. It's unfortunately called the Police Power Act. I think you heard Dershowitz mention that there. It's called the Police Power Act. And the role of the state is to protect public health and safety. So listen, I hope we don't get there. It's still really early. It's not as deadly, but like smallpox, bad news. If you don't have it, so there's a study in England at the time, 40% of people who didn't have a vaccine got it and 10% died. So like smallpox is way, way worse than this. And the real question is, how much compliance does the government want? If the government only needs 70% compliance, then this may not be a problem. But if the government demands that everyone get the vaccine, it's going to be a lot more than the anti-vaxxers that the government's going to have to deal with. 100% compliance, if that's what's required, then this is absolutely going to become a problem. So again, we're a little early for this, but be prepared. It might be a thing one day. True story. Mike Slater, have a great rest of your day. We'll see you tomorrow. Spread the word.